The worst sound I've ever heard wasn't the screams. It was the silence afterward. Detective Marcus Johnson's weathered face tightens as he recalls that April morning in 2016. The 20-year veteran of the Lakeside Police Department sits across from me, his coffee untouched, eyes fixed on something distant and haunting. You expect certain things in this job. You prepare for them. But nothing prepares you for walking into a house and finding two people stabbed to death in their beds. And then discovering the killers are just children themselves. 14 years old. Still wearing cartoon pajamas while they watched movies downstairs. He pauses, rubbing his temple. And the worst part? When I asked where the mother was, the boy just looked me dead in the eye and said, "Go upstairs and look." No emotion. Like he was telling me where to find the bathroom. What transforms a child into a killer? What darkness takes root in the minds we consider most innocent? And how does a community ever recover from the knowledge that the monsters weren't hiding under the bed, they were sleeping in it? Welcome to Silent Crime Witness, where we tell the stories that others won't. The ones that stay with you long after the video ends. The ones that make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. If you believe these stories need to be told, if you believe there's value in understanding what went wrong so we can prevent the next tragedy, then please take a second to support this channel. Hit that subscribe button. Click like if you want YouTube to push the story out to more people. And drop a comment below with your thoughts. This is more than a video. This is a reckoning with the darkest corners of humanity. Tonight, we journey to Lakeside, Michigan to unravel one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history, a case that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about childhood innocence and the capacity for evil that may exist in all of us. April 15, 2016. Lakeside, Michigan. From above, Lakeside appears picturesque, a small city nestled against the shores of Lake Michigan, its downtown dotted with century-old buildings that speak to a more prosperous past. But descend closer and the cracks begin to show. Abandoned factories. Boarded-up storefronts. Streets in disrepair. Once a thriving hub of automotive manufacturing, Lakeside has been in steady decline since the factories began closing in the 1980s. Unemployment hovers around 18%. 1 in 4 residents lives below the poverty line. The opioid crisis has hit particularly hard here, leaving a generation of children to essentially raise themselves. The east side of town, where our story unfolds, has borne the brunt of this decline. Here, amid crumbling apartment complexes and neglected public housing, stood a modest 2-story home on Maple Street. It wasn't much to look at: vinyl siding in need of repair, a small yard overtaken by weeds. But to 49-year-old Tamika Jackson, it represented everything she'd fought for: stability, independence, a safe place to raise her daughters. Tamika was determined to give those girls a better life than she'd had, says Denise Williams, who worked alongside Tamika in the cafeteria at Lakeside Elementary School. She grew up in Detroit, in the projects. Father wasn't around. Mother had addiction issues. Tamika was raising her younger siblings by the time she was 12. Despite these challenges, Tamika had graduated high school and briefly attended community college before becoming pregnant with her first daughter, Shanice. The baby's father, Darius Jackson, had seemed promising at first: employed, attentive, eager to build a family. But the facade quickly crumbled. Darius had a temper, explains Tamika's sister, Latoya Carter. He'd fly into these rages over nothing: dinner not being ready, the baby crying too loud. He never hit Tamika in front of other people, but we all knew what was happening behind closed doors. For 3 years, Tamika endured the abuse, convinced she could change him, determined to keep her family intact. But when Darius's violence escalated to the point where neighbors called police, Tamika finally made the decision to leave. She took 3-year-old Shanice and fled to Lakeside, where Latoya had settled a few years earlier. She arrived on my doorstep with a black eye, a garbage bag full of clothes, and a toddler who flinched at every loud noise, Latoya recalls. I barely recognized my own sister. That's what living with violence does to a person. It erases them. In Lakeside, Tamika slowly began to rebuild her life. She found work in the school cafeteria. She enrolled in night classes to earn her GED. She saved enough for a security deposit on a small apartment. And a year after arriving in Lakeside, she gave birth to her second daughter, Kiara, the product of a brief relationship with a man who disappeared when he learned Tamika was pregnant. As a single mother with 2 young children, Tamika struggled financially but was determined to provide stability. When Shanice was 7 and Kiara was 3, Tamika managed to secure a mortgage on the small house on Maple Street, an achievement that filled her with immense pride. That house meant everything to her, says Andre Thomas, who began dating Tamika when the girls were in middle school. It wasn't fancy, but it was hers. She'd point to different features, the back porch she'd built herself, the garden she'd planted, and just beam with pride. She used to tell the girls, "No one can ever take this away from us. This is our safe place." But for Shanice, the house on Maple Street never felt safe. According to school records, she was a withdrawn child who struggled to connect with her peers. Teachers noted her tendency to lash out when frustrated, her difficulty following rules, her apparent lack of empathy when her actions hurt others. There was always something a little off about Shanice, says her third-grade teacher, Michelle Davis. Most children, when they hurt someone, they show remorse. They feel bad. Shanice never did. If she pushed another child on the code playground, she'd just stare blankly when confronted about it. No tears, no apologies, no emotional response at all. By middle school, Shanice was regularly seeing the school counselor for behavioral issues. Her academic performance, once promising, had begun to decline. She had few friends and spent most of her time alone, writing in a journal that she kept fiercely private. "I caught a glimpse of that journal once," Andre recalls. Tamika would never invade her daughter's privacy by reading it, but one day it was open on the coffee table when I came over. The page was filled with these disturbing drawings. People with their throats cut, houses on fire. When I mentioned it to Tamika, she just sighed and said, "Shanice has always had a vivid imagination." But imagination wasn't the only force driving Shanice's dark thoughts. The trauma of her early years, witnessing her father's violence, experiencing the instability of frequent moves, feeling abandoned first by her father, and then by her mother's attention being divided with a new baby, had left deep psychological scars. Children who witness domestic violence often develop complex trauma responses, explains child psychologist Dr. Angela Martinez. Their developing brains are literally shaped by the constant state of fear and hypervigilance. This can manifest in various ways: difficulty regulating emotions, problems forming attachments, a distorted sense of what constitutes normal relationships. For Shanice, these trauma responses manifested in a growing resentment toward her mother and sister. As Kiara thrived under Tamika's guidance, earning good grades, participating in church activities, forming healthy friendships, Shanice withdrew further into herself, convinced that her mother favored her younger sister. The dynamic in that household was complicated, says school counselor James Wilson, who worked with Shanice during her middle school years. Tamika was a loving mother who wanted the best for both her daughters, but she was also exhausted from working multiple jobs and trying to keep the household afloat. Kiara was simply easier to parent. She was compliant, affectionate, eager to please. Shanice required more energy, more patience, more specialized attention that Tamika, despite her best efforts, couldn't always provide. This perceived favoritism became a festering wound in Shanice's psyche, one that would later be used to justify the unthinkable. But Shanice wasn't the only troubled teen in this story. Darius Mitchell's childhood was, if anything, even more traumatic than his girlfriend's. Born in Chicago in 2001, Darius lost his mother to leukemia when he was just 4 years old. His father, struggling with alcoholism and grief, was unable to care for him. Darius bounced between foster homes and relatives' houses, never staying in one place long enough to form stable attachments. Darius's case file reads like a textbook example of attachment disorder, says Dr. Martinez. By the time he was 10, he'd lived in 7 different households. Each transition represented another broken bond, another adult who failed to provide the consistency and security he desperately needed. The impact of this instability was evident in Darius's behavior. By age 8, he was setting fires and harming animals, classic warning signs of conduct disorder. By 12, he had been diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder and was known to Child Protective Services in 3 different counties. The system failed this child at every turn, argues social worker Tanya Roberts, who reviewed Darius's case after the murders. His file is filled with red flags that should have triggered intensive intervention. Instead, he was simply passed from one placement to another, each new caregiver less equipped than the last to handle his escalating behaviors. Darius finally landed in Lakeside when his aunt, Marlene Mitchell, agreed to take him in. Marlene, a night shift nurse with 3 children of her own, hoped that a fresh start might help her troubled nephew. She enrolled him in Lakeside Middle School and arranged for him to see a therapist at the community mental health center. Marlene tried, says her neighbor, Robert Johnson. She really did. But she was already stretched thin with her own kids and working nights. Darius needed more supervision, more structure than she could provide. He was basically raising himself. It was at Lakeside Middle School that Darius and Shanice first crossed paths. Both outsiders, both carrying deep emotional wounds, they recognized something in each other that no one else seemed to see. They were like magnets, recalls classmate Jamal Washington. From the moment they met, they were inseparable. It was weird, actually. Like they had their own private world that nobody else could enter. Their relationship quickly became all-consuming. Teachers noted that both students' behavior and academic performance deteriorated further after they became a couple. They were frequently caught skipping class to be together, and both began to withdraw from whatever social connections they had previously maintained. Darius was always a loner, says his former teacher, Sarah Johnson. But after he started dating Shanice, it was like he disappeared into the relationship. They became this self-contained unit. Us against the world. This intensity concerned the adults in their lives. Marlene tried to limit Darius's time with Shanice, insisting he focus on improving his grades. But her work schedule made it impossible to enforce these boundaries consistently. Darius would simply wait until she left for her shift, then sneak out to meet Shanice. Tamika Jackson immediately recognized the danger in this intense relationship. She saw in Darius the same volatility she had fled from in her ex-husband. She tried to limit Shanice's contact with him, eventually banning him from their home entirely. That was the match that lit the fuse, says Detective Johnson. Tamika was trying to protect her daughter from what she saw as a destructive relationship. But to Shanice, it was the ultimate betrayal, proof that her mother didn't want her to be happy. In October 2015, 6 months before the murders, Shanice and Darius ran away together. They lived in an abandoned building for nearly a week before police found them and returned them to their respective homes. Rather than serving as a wake-up call, this incident only deepened their determination to be together at any cost. After they ran away, Tamika took away Shanice's phone, her computer, everything she could use to contact Darius, says Andre Thomas. She even talked about sending Shanice to live with relatives in Atlanta. She was desperate to separate them. But the teenagers found ways to communicate at school. And as their desperation grew, so did their resentment toward the one person they saw as standing in their way, Tamika Jackson. The final trigger came in early April 2016. After discovering that Shanice was still seeing Darius despite her prohibitions, Tamika emptied her daughter's bedroom, removing her possessions and giving some of them to Kiara as punishment. That was the breaking point, says Detective Johnson. In Shanice's mind, her mother had not only tried to separate her from the one person who understood her, but had now given her things to the sister she already resented. In her police interview, she said that was when she decided her mother had to die. What followed was a series of calculated discussions between the two teenagers about how best to carry out the murders. They met at a local fast food restaurant where, between bites of burgers and fries, they debated methods and timing. It's chilling to read the transcripts of their interviews, says prosecutor Michael Reynolds. They discussed murder the way most kids their age might discuss a video game strategy. There was no emotion, no recognition of the gravity of what they were planning. The plan they settled on was for Darius to steal knives from his aunt's kitchen, walk to Shanice's house in the middle of the night, and be let in through a window. Shanice would direct him to her mother's room where he would kill Tamika. Then they would kill Kiara, who might otherwise call for help. They attempted this plan twice before succeeding. On the first night, Shanice fell asleep and didn't hear Darius's signal. On the second, she was awake but couldn't open the window without making noise. But on April 13, 2016, everything went according to plan. Darius arrived at the Jackson home around 2 a.m. carrying 4 kitchen knives in his backpack. He tapped 3 times on the bathroom window, their prearranged signal. Shanice let him in and they proceeded to Tamika's bedroom. While Shanice watched from the doorway, Darius stabbed the sleeping woman in the throat and then smothered her with a pillow to stifle her cries. When Tamika raised her hands to defend herself, he stabbed them repeatedly until she stopped moving. The teenagers then moved to Kiara's room. The younger girl woke up as they entered and managed to cry out, "I can't," before Darius slashed her throat, cutting off her ability to speak or scream. Like her mother, she was then smothered with a pillow. With both victims dead, Shanice and Darius took a bath together to wash off the blood. They changed into clean clothes, went downstairs, and settled on the couch to watch movies and eat ice cream as if they hadn't just committed an unimaginable atrocity upstairs. And that's where police found them nearly 2 days later, curled up together, watching vampire romance films, the bodies of their victims decomposing above them. In my 20 years as a prosecutor, I've never seen anything like it, says Reynolds. The complete lack of empathy, the absence of any normal human reaction to what they'd done, it's beyond comprehension. In the months following their arrest, mental health professionals attempted to understand what had gone so terribly wrong with these two young people. Both underwent extensive psychological evaluation to determine if they could be held fully responsible for their actions. Darius was found to have conduct disorder and attachment issues stemming from his early childhood trauma, but no condition that would prevent him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. He initially pleaded guilty to manslaughter, claiming diminished responsibility, but later changed his plea to murder. Shanice's case was more complex. Her defense team argued that she suffered from an adjustment disorder and severe attachment issues due to her early exposure to domestic violence and her troubled relationship with her mother. They claimed these factors, combined with the intense pressure of her relationship with Darius, had impaired her ability to think rationally. This was a child who had never formed a secure attachment to her primary caregiver, explains defense psychiatrist Dr. James Wilson. When she finally found that connection with Darius, it became all-consuming. In her mind, anything that threatened that relationship was an existential threat. The prosecution's expert disagreed, arguing that while Shanice had certainly experienced trauma, she was fully aware of the wrongfulness of murder and had participated in extensive planning that demonstrated clear intent. Trauma explains behavior, but it doesn't excuse it, says prosecution psychiatrist Dr. Helen Morris. Many children experience difficult childhoods without resorting to violence. Shanice knew exactly what she was doing. After hearing both arguments, the jury unanimously found Shanice guilty of murder. In October 2016, both teenagers were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years, later reduced on appeal to 17.5 years. The judge's comments during sentencing were scathing. You were, in my view, in a hermetically sealed, pathetic world of your own, of deep, deep selfishness and immaturity where only your feelings and desires mattered and nobody else's. But the case raises profound questions that extend far beyond the courtroom. Could these murders have been prevented? Were there warning signs that were missed? And what does this case tell us about the capacity for violence in those we consider the most innocent members of society? There were multiple points of intervention that were missed, argues child welfare advocate Tanya Roberts. Shanice's suicide attempt just weeks before the murders should have been a major red flag. Her self-harming behaviors, her running away, these were all cries for help that went unanswered. Indeed, just 1 month before the murders, Shanice had taken an overdose of pills and left a suicide note. She was hospitalized briefly but released after being deemed low risk. The incident was treated as a typical teenage crisis rather than an indicator of serious mental disturbance. We need to take adolescent mental health much more seriously, says Dr. Martinez. These weren't just moody teenagers. These were deeply traumatized young people who needed intensive intervention long before they reached the point of violence. Others point to the toxic nature of Shanice and Darius's relationship as a warning sign that should have prompted more aggressive intervention. What we saw here was a folie à deux, a shared psychosis, explains forensic psychologist Dr. Michael Brown. Separately, these teens were troubled but probably not homicidal. Together, they created an alternate reality where murder seemed like a reasonable solution to their problems. We need better tools for identifying and addressing these dangerous dynamics in adolescent relationships. This also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about childhood, innocence, and evil. Can children be born evil, or are they made that way by circumstance? The evidence suggests the latter. What we're looking at here is the devastating impact of early developmental trauma, says Dr. Martinez. Both of these teenagers experienced profound disruptions in their primary attachments during critical periods of brain development. This doesn't excuse their actions, but it helps explain how children can become capable of such violence. For the community of Lakeside, the murders shattered any illusion that such horrors only happen elsewhere. The knowledge that children raised among them could commit such an atrocity forced a painful reckoning. After it happened, people started paying more attention to the kids in the neighborhood, says Pastor Wilson. There was this collective realization that we'd failed these children somehow, not just Shanice and Darius, but all the struggling kids in our community. We started asking what we could do differently. The school district implemented more comprehensive mental health screening. The local church established a youth mentoring program. Community organizations expanded after-school activities to give teens safe spaces and positive influences. Something good has to come from this tragedy, says Denise Williams, Tamika's colleague. We can't bring Tamika and Kiara back, but maybe we can prevent another family from being destroyed. As for Shanice and Darius, they remain in separate juvenile detention facilities, where they will stay until at least their early 30s. Whether they can be rehabilitated remains an open question. These are still developing brains, says Dr. Hayes. There's potential for change, for growth, for the development of empathy, but it will require intensive, long-term therapeutic intervention. And even then, the prognosis is guarded at best. The sun sets over Lakeside as I finish my investigation. The house on Maple Street where Tamika and Kiara Jackson lost their lives stands empty, a silent reminder of the tragedy that unfolded within its walls. The community continues to heal, to search for meaning in the senseless, to protect their children from the darkness that consumed Shanice and Darius. But perhaps the most important lesson of this case is that the line between victim and perpetrator is often blurrier than we'd like to admit. Shanice and Darius were both victims of circumstance long before they became perpetrators of violence. This doesn't diminish their responsibility for their actions, but it does challenge us to intervene earlier, to recognize the warning signs of trauma before they manifest as violence. Children who kill force us to confront the uncomfortable reality that innocence can be corrupted, that the capacity for evil exists within all of us, and that society bears some responsibility when its youngest members commit the most heinous acts imaginable. If you found value in this story, if it made you think, made you feel, made you see the world a little differently, then I'm asking for your support. Hit that subscribe button right now. It costs you nothing, but it helps ensure these stories continue to be told. Like this video so the algorithm pushes it to others who need to hear it. And most importantly, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. What do you think drives children to kill? How can we better protect vulnerable young people from the effects of trauma? What responsibility do we have to intervene when we see troubled relationships forming between adolescents? Your engagement doesn't just support this channel, it creates a community of people who refuse to look away from difficult truths, who believe that understanding is the first step toward prevention. I'll be back tomorrow with another case that mainstream media has forgotten or oversimplified, another story that deserves to be told in full. Until then, remember, the monsters aren't born. They're made often right before our eyes when we fail to see the child crying out for help. This is Silent Crime Witness. Thank you for bearing witness with me.